In the psychology department of Cornell University, preserved in a glass jar filled with formaldehyde, sits one of the most notorious brains in American criminal history. At 1,073 cubic centimeters, it belonged to a man who could speak 8 languages fluently, translate ancient Greek texts, and formulate complex theories about human linguistics. Yet this same brilliant mind orchestrated brutal murders that shocked 19th century America. The brain belonged to Edward Howard Rulloff, teacher, doctor, inventor, philologist, and killer. For decades, authorities across New York State struggled to understand how such intellectual brilliance could coexist with such calculated evil. Tonight, we uncover the chilling truth behind the man newspapers called the Genius Killer, a story of academic ambition funded by blood, where the pursuit of knowledge became an obsession that justified murder. Before we continue with the story of Edward Rulloff and his reign of terror across New York's Finger Lakes region, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We upload new dark mysteries every week, and we'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment telling us your state or city. The case of Edward Rulloff would forever change how Americans viewed the criminal mind, proving that evil could wear the mask of scholarly respectability, and that genius itself could become a weapon of destruction. The year was 1842, and the rolling hills of central New York were alive with opportunity and transformation. The Erie Canal had turned sleepy farming communities into bustling trade centers, while the Second Great Awakening had filled the region with religious fervor and social reform movements. Education was becoming the pathway to prosperity in this new America, and small towns competed to attract learned men who could elevate their cultural standing. It was into this landscape of hope and progress that a young man named Edward Rulloff arrived in the village of Dryden, just east of Ithaca. To the locals, he seemed like a gift from Providence itself. Rulloff was 23 years old, tall and distinguished-looking, with a commanding presence that immediately set him apart from the rough canal workers and farmers who typically passed through town. His dark hair was meticulously groomed, his clothing neat and scholarly, and his piercing dark eyes seemed to hold depths of knowledge that impressed everyone he met. When he spoke, it was with the cultured accent of an educated gentleman, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. The residents of Dryden had rarely encountered anyone with such apparent erudition. Rulloff claimed extensive knowledge of botany and medicine, could recite passages in Latin, Greek, and German with fluid precision, and seemed equally comfortable discussing philosophy, literature, and the emerging sciences. When he began delivering lectures on phrenology, the popular pseudoscience of reading character through skull measurements, the townspeople gathered in amazement at his apparent mastery of this fashionable field of study. But beneath this impressive exterior lay secrets that would have horrified his admirers. Born John Edward Howard Rulloffson near St. John, New Brunswick, around 1819 or 1820, he had already lived a double life before crossing into the United States. His father, Rulloff Rulloffson, had been a Danish immigrant who achieved some prosperity as a justice of the peace, but the family's fortunes had declined after his death in 1827. Young Edward had shown early promise as a scholar, devouring books with an insatiable hunger for knowledge that impressed his teachers and neighbors alike. However, his intellectual gifts had been corrupted by an early taste for crime. By the time he reached his teens, Edward had been caught in a series of suspicious fires at the dry goods store where he worked, arsons apparently designed to cover up inventory thefts. When he was observed wearing clothing that matched items reported stolen, he was convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to 2 years in prison. The experience should have been a wake-up call, but instead it became his criminal education, teaching him the value of careful planning and the importance of maintaining a respectable facade. After his release, he had crossed into the United States, abandoning his birth name for the more distinguished Edward Rulloff. The change was more than cosmetic. It represented his transformation from common criminal to something far more dangerous, a predator who could blend seamlessly into respectable society. His years of imprisonment had given him time to study and plan, emerging with a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate others through displays of learning and charm. In Dryden, Rulloff quickly established himself as an invaluable member of the community. He found employment as a clerk in the local drugstore, where his apparent knowledge of botanical medicines impressed both his employer and customers. His learning seemed boundless. He could discuss the latest philosophical works from Europe, analyze political developments with insight, and demonstrate practical knowledge of everything from photography to carpentry. The community, starved for intellectual stimulation in their rural setting, embraced him with an enthusiasm that fed his growing sense of superiority. His reputation grew rapidly through the region. Farmers consulted him about their crops, local politicians sought his advice on matters of governance, and prominent families invited him to dinner parties where his conversation was the evening's entertainment. Soon the community offered him the position of headmaster at their local school, a role that would give him not only respectability, but access to young minds he could influence and potentially corrupt. Among his pupils was 17-year-old Harriet Shutt, daughter of one of the area's most respected farming families. Harriet was considered a rare beauty, even in a region known for its handsome women. Tall and slender with long, light brown hair that caught the sunlight, pale skin that spoke of genteel upbringing, and hazel eyes that sparkled with intelligence and gentle humor. She possessed the kind of refined mannerisms and educated speech that marked her as gentry in this rural community, having been fortunate enough to receive more education than most young women of her time. The Shutt family had prospered through hard work and careful management of their substantial farm holdings. They were among the area's most prominent citizens, known for their generosity to neighbors and their active participation in community affairs. Harriet's father, John Shutt, was a man of considerable influence who took pride in his daughter's accomplishments and had high expectations for her future marriage. The family represented everything that was stable and respectable about rural American life in the 1840s. The attraction between teacher and student was immediate and intense, though it would prove to be built on the most dangerous foundation imaginable. Rulloff, despite his scholarly demeanor, possessed a magnetic charisma that drew people to him like moths to a flame. He could be utterly charming when it suited his purposes, weaving tales of his travels and studies that painted him as a man of the world who had seen wonders beyond the provincial horizons of central New York. For a young woman like Harriet, living within the comfortable but confining boundaries of rural society, he represented everything exotic and sophisticated that her sheltered life had never offered. But even in these early days of courtship, there were warning signs that those around them chose to ignore or rationalize away. Rulloff's temper, when provoked, could be frightening in its intensity and seemingly unpredictable in its triggers. He displayed an almost pathological jealousy whenever other men showed even innocent interest in Harriet, and his moods could shift from charming affability to cold, calculating rage in moments. The Shutt family, while impressed by his obvious learning and apparent prospects, harbored private doubts about their daughter's suitor On December 31st, 1843, as heavy snow blanketed the Finger Lakes region and families throughout central New York gathered for New Year's celebrations, Edward Rulloff and Harriet Shutt were united in marriage during a simple but well-attended ceremony at the Shutt family farm. The wedding should have been a joyous occasion marking the beginning of a promising union between two intelligent young people, but even on this day meant for celebration, Rulloff's true nature began to emerge in ways that should have terrified everyone present. The ceremony itself proceeded normally until the traditional moment when the minister, following time-honored custom, congratulated the bride with a gentle kiss on the cheek. In that instant, Rulloff's carefully maintained facade cracked, revealing the violent jealousy that would define their marriage. His face darkened with such fury that several wedding guests stepped back in alarm, and his eyes flashed with a rage so intense and unexpected that it cast a pall over the entire celebration. Here was a man flying into jealous fury over an innocent gesture from a clergyman, behavior that should have warned everyone present of the violence lurking beneath his scholarly exterior. The wedding guests, unsure how to interpret this disturbing outburst, chose to attribute it to wedding day nerves, or perhaps the stress of joining a prominent family. But Harriet herself had seen something in her new husband's eyes that chilled her to the bone, though she told herself it was merely the intensity of his love for her. The honeymoon period that followed was brief and troubled, marked by moments of passionate devotion, interrupted by flashes of the same terrifying rage that had marked their wedding day. Within months of their marriage, Rulloff had convinced Harriet to move with him to the nearby village of Lansing, ostensibly to give them privacy to build their new life together, but really to isolate his young wife from her family's protective influence. The move represented more than a simple change of address. It was a calculated strategy to cut Harriet off from the support system that might have helped her escape the nightmare her marriage was becoming. In Lansing, Rulloff set up practice as a botanical physician, using his self-taught knowledge of herbs and medicines to treat local residents who had limited access to formally trained doctors. His reputation as a healer grew rapidly, and soon prominent families throughout the region were seeking his services for everything from common ailments to serious medical emergencies. He charged reasonable fees and seemed genuinely concerned for his patients' welfare, further cementing his reputation as a valuable member of the community. The young couple's modest home became a center of intellectual activity in the small village. Rulloff continued his scholarly pursuits, filling their rooms with books on subjects ranging from classical languages to natural philosophy. He spent hours each day reading and writing, working on what he claimed would be groundbreaking theories about the formation and evolution of human language. To observers, he appeared to be the ideal combination of practical healer and theoretical scholar, a man who could bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern learning. In April 1845, after more than a year of marriage, Harriet gave birth to a daughter they named Priscilla. The infant was healthy and beautiful, with her mother's delicate features and what appeared to be her father's intelligent eyes. For a brief time, the arrival of their child seemed to calm Rulloff's volatile nature and bring out genuinely tender qualities that few had suspected he possessed. He appeared devoted to both his wife and infant daughter, spending hours reading to them from his extensive library and discussing his ambitious plans for their family's future. Rulloff spoke frequently of opportunities waiting for him in the growing territories of the American West, particularly Ohio, where he claimed to have been offered a position as a college professor. He painted vivid pictures of the life they could build there, away from the constraints and gossip of small-town New York, where his genius would finally receive the recognition it deserved. These dreams seemed reasonable to Harriet, who had grown accustomed to her husband's grandiose visions and believed in his exceptional abilities. But the domestic tranquility was shattered by the continued presence in their lives of Dr. Henry Bull, Rulloff's business partner, and Harriet's cousin. Bull was a genuine physician who had taken Rulloff under his wing to teach him botanical medicine. Impressed by the younger man's apparent knowledge and dedication, he was also a member of the extended Schutt family network, maintaining the kind of easy, affectionate relationships with his female relatives that was common in close-knit rural communities. Bull's friendly demeanor and family connections, which should have been natural and unremarkable, became the source of Rulloff's growing paranoia and rage. The doctor's habit of greeting Harriet with a kiss on the cheek, the same innocent gesture that had triggered Rulloff's wedding day outburst, drove him into paroxysms of jealous fury. He became convinced that his wife was having an affair with her cousin, despite the complete absence of any evidence to support his suspicions, and the ridiculous nature of the accusation given their family relationship. As spring turned to summer in 1845, Rulloff's jealousy reached dangerous proportions. He began following Harriet whenever she left the house, questioning her about every conversation she had with other men, and flying into rages over imagined slights and perceived infidelities. The brilliant scholar who could discuss philosophy and literature with such eloquence became a monster of suspicion and violence within the walls of his own home. The crisis that would shatter multiple families began in May 1845, when tragedy struck the extended Schutt clan. Harriet's sister-in-law, the wife of her brother William, fell gravely ill shortly after giving birth to her second child. Both mother and infant were suffering from what appeared to be a serious infection, and the family naturally turned to their relative by marriage, who had established himself as a skilled healer. Rulloff agreed to treat them, preparing an herbal remedy using his botanical knowledge and administering it personally to both patients with apparent concern for their welfare. Within 48 hours of receiving Rulloff's treatment, both the young mother and her infant child were dead. While such deaths were tragically common in an era before modern medicine and antibiotics, the timing and circumstances struck some family members as suspicious. Rulloff showed no grief at their passing, instead making ominous comments to his mother-in-law about who might go next. Words that seemed less like expressions of sorrow and more like veiled threats. The deaths created an immediate and irreparable rift between Rulloff and the Schutt family. Whispers began to circulate about whether the supposed healer had actually hastened the deaths of his own relatives, though no one dared voice such accusations openly. The family's previous reservations about Rulloff crystallized into active suspicion and hostility, creating a pressure cooker atmosphere that would soon explode into violence. Feeling the weight of his in-laws' suspicion and increasingly desperate to escape the growing hostility around him, Rulloff became more determined than ever to convince Harriet to abandon her family and move to Ohio with him. He painted vivid pictures of the new life they could build in the West, where his genius would finally receive proper recognition, and where they could escape the small-minded gossips who failed to appreciate his exceptional gifts. But Harriet, still grieving the deaths of her sister-in-law and infant niece, was reluctant to leave her family during such a difficult time. The couple's arguments about their future became increasingly violent and frequent. Rulloff could not understand why his wife would choose loyalty to her family over devotion to him, and his frustration fed the paranoid conviction that she was being turned against him by relatives who had never truly accepted him. His jealousy, always simmering beneath the surface, now boiled over into open accusations of infidelity and betrayal. On the evening of June 22nd, 1844, as a summer thunderstorm rumbled across Cayuga Lake and lightning illuminated the darkening sky, Edward Rulloff committed the crime that would define his legacy and haunt central New York for generations. The humid air was thick with tension as another argument erupted between husband and wife in their small house in Lansing, this time about Rulloff's increasingly desperate demands that they leave immediately for Ohio. Harriet was in the kitchen, engaged in the mundane domestic task of crushing peppercorns with a heavy iron pestle, when her husband's rage finally reached its breaking point. He had been drinking, which always made his temper more volatile, and his accusations of infidelity had become more wild and specific. When Harriet laughed off his latest charges and firmly refused his demands to abandon her grieving family, something fundamental snapped in the scholar's brilliant but twisted mind. The sequence of events that followed would be recounted years later, when Rulloff finally confessed to the crime present during those terrible moments. In the explosion of pure rage, fed by months of building resentment and paranoid jealousy, Rulloff snatched the iron pestle from his wife's hands and brought it down on her forehead with devastating force. The blow was delivered with such violence that Harriet collapsed instantly, blood streaming from the massive wound and pooling beneath her head on the kitchen floor. The sound of the impact and her falling body seemed to echo through the small house, followed by an eerie silence broken only by the rumble of thunder outside. Rulloff stood over his wife's body, watching as the life drained out of the woman he claimed to love, feeling no remorse but only a cold satisfaction that she would never defy him again. But his crime was not yet complete. As Harriet lay dying on the kitchen floor, their infant daughter Priscilla began to cry in her cradle, disturbed by the commotion and perhaps sensing that something terrible had happened to her mother. The sound of the baby's wailing seemed to pierce through Rulloff's rage, reminding him that he now had a witness to his crime, a witness who would someday grow old enough to remember and testify against him. With the same calculating coldness that had marked his academic pursuits, Rulloff made another terrible decision. Moving to his collection of botanical medicines, he prepared what he later described as a narcotic, likely a concentrated dose of the same plant-based poisons he had been using to treat patients throughout the region. The preparation of the fatal dose was done with the precision of a trained pharmacist, measuring and mixing ingredients with the same care he had once devoted to healing. Returning to the cradle where Priscilla continued to cry, Rulloff administered the poison with gentle hands, perhaps telling himself that he was simply putting the child to sleep. The baby's cries gradually weakened and then stopped entirely, leaving the house filled with the kind of terrible silence that would haunt anyone who had witnessed such evil. In the space of less than an hour, the brilliant scholar had destroyed his entire family, transforming from respected healer to cold-blooded killer. The disappearance of Harriet and Priscilla Rulloff in late June 1844 sent shockwaves through the close-knit community of Lansing and the surrounding Finger Lakes region. When concerned neighbors came calling the following day and found Rulloff alone in his house, his explanations raised immediate and profound suspicions that would only deepen with each passing hour. The scene inside the Rulloff home told a story that contradicted every explanation their host offered. The house bore all the signs of hasty abandonment. Beds left unmade with sheets twisted and thrown aside, dirty dishes scattered across the kitchen table where they had apparently been left mid-meal, and personal belongings scattered haphazardly throughout the rooms. Most tellingly, Harriet's cherished traveling basket, which she never went anywhere without, still sat prominently on her bureau alongside her jewelry and other precious possessions. Rulloff's attempts to explain his family's absence only deepened the growing mystery and suspicion. His stories changed with each telling, as if he were improvising details as he went along. Initially, he claimed that Harriet and Priscilla had gone to visit relatives in a cottage between Cayuga and Seneca Lakes. But when pressed for specifics, he couldn't provide exact locations or expected return dates. When this story failed to satisfy questioners, he switched to claiming they were visiting family in Erie, Pennsylvania, and finally settled on an elaborate tale about their relocation to Madison, Ohio. Each new version of events raised more questions than it answered. Why would Harriet leave without her traveling basket and personal effects? How could she have departed without telling her close-knit family where she was going? What circumstances would have motivated such a sudden and secretive departure? The more Rulloff talked, the less believable his stories became, and the more convinced his listeners grew that something terrible had happened to his wife and child. When confronted directly about these inconsistencies, Rulloff offered to write a letter to his wife, asking her to contact her family and dispel what he characterized as malicious rumors circulating about their welfare. The letter was duly written in his precise scholarly hand, with flowery language expressing concern for her family's worries and requesting immediate communication to set their minds at ease. But days turned to weeks, and no response ever came, a silence that spoke louder than any words could have. For 6 agonizing weeks, Rulloff maintained his increasingly desperate charade, playing the role of the concerned husband whose family was simply traveling for reasons he couldn't fully explain. He continued his practice as a botanical physician, treating patients with the same apparent skill and compassion that had made his reputation, all while knowing that the bodies of his victims lay hidden beneath the dark waters of Cayuga Lake. But the community's suspicions grew stronger and more focused with each passing day. The Schutt family, led by Harriet's protective brothers William and Ephraim, refused to accept Rulloff's evolving explanations. They knew their sister's character intimately, her deep devotion to family, her responsible nature, and her habit of maintaining regular correspondence with relatives. Her sudden disappearance without word was completely inconsistent with everything they knew about her personality and values. The family's investigation took on the character of a determined manhunt, with William and Ephraim Schutt questioning neighbors, searching the surrounding countryside, and applying increasing pressure on their brother-in-law to provide satisfactory answers. Their efforts were complicated by Rulloff's continued presence in the community and his ability to maintain his facade of respectability. But their persistence began to yield disturbing information about his behavior in the days immediately following the disappearance. Several neighbors came forward to report seeing Rulloff on the morning after his family's supposed departure, loading mysterious bundles and what appeared to be a large, heavy chest into a wagon borrowed from the Anderson family. Witnesses described his demeanor as nervous and furtive, completely unlike his usual confident bearing. Most significantly, multiple people reported seeing him driving the loaded wagon toward Cayuga Lake in the early morning hours, taking a route that led away from any of the destinations he had claimed his family had traveled to. When the pressure of investigation and community suspicion became too great, Rulloff suddenly vanished from Lansing, claiming he was going to rejoin his family in Ohio and bring them back to silence the unfair accusations being made against him. His departure in the middle of the night, without settling his affairs or providing any forwarding address, only confirmed the community's worst suspicions about his guilt. Was not content to let his sister's suspected killer escape justice through flight. A man of considerable determination and physical courage, he mounted his buckboard and set off in pursuit, beginning a dramatic cross-state manhunt that would take him through multiple cities and railroad stations. The chase became a test of wills between a grieving brother seeking justice and a killer desperately trying to escape the consequences of his crimes. The pursuit reached its climax at a crowded train platform in Rochester, where Ephraim spotted Rulloff attempting to board a departing train bound for Buffalo and points west. In a scene that could have been lifted from the pages of a contemporary adventure novel, Rulloff attempted to disappear into the crowd of travelers, using his knowledge of human nature and crowd psychology to evade detection. But Ephraim's determination proved stronger than Rulloff's cunning, and after a thorough search of the train cars, he found the fugitive hiding in the rearmost compartment. Even when cornered, Rulloff maintained his composure and continued his deception with remarkable audacity. Rather than confessing or showing any sign of guilt, he expressed surprise and pleasure at encountering his brother-in-law, claiming that the meeting was fortuitous since he was indeed on his way to rejoin Harriet and Priscilla in Ohio. With characteristic boldness, he even suggested that Ephraim accompany him on the journey to see for himself that his sister and niece were safe and well. The two men traveled together in an atmosphere of barely concealed tension, with Ephraim watching his companion's every move while Rulloff maintained his performance as the innocent husband eager to reunite his family. They proceeded to Buffalo, where they spent an uncomfortable night at a hotel, each man knowing that the other was playing a dangerous game whose outcome could mean life or death. The next morning, as they made their way to the crowded docks to catch an early steamboat for Cleveland, Rulloff demonstrated the cunning that would serve him throughout his criminal career. Using the confusion and crowds of a busy port as cover, he managed to slip away from Ephraim's watchful eye, disappearing into the press of passengers boarding the steamboat. By the time Ephraim realized his quarry had escaped, Rulloff had vanished completely, leaving his brother-in-law alone and more convinced than ever that Harriet and Priscilla were dead. Back in Lansing, the community organized a systematic search for the missing women that represented one of the most thorough criminal investigations of its era. Cayuga Lake, the longest of the 11 glacial Finger Lakes in central New York, became the focus of their efforts based on witness reports of Rulloff's suspicious wagon journey. Teams of men worked in shifts, using hooks, nets, and primitive diving equipment to search the lake's murky depths for any trace of the bodies. The search was hampered by the lake's considerable depth and the unclear waters that could hide secrets for decades. Cayuga Lake extends for nearly 40 miles and reaches depths of over 400 feet in some areas, providing countless places where weighted bodies could rest undisturbed. Despite weeks of intensive searching that involved dozens of volunteers and considerable expense, no trace of Harriet or Priscilla was ever found. The investigation revealed